Now there's all kinds of different people in this world. There's only one high.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Team Made Apart podcast, the podcast designed to teach those who work remotely and those who hire them how to work better together. I'm your host, Ryan Rogar. Before we get started, as always, today's show is brought to you by teammadeapart.com. Team Made Apart features articles, tools, and resources designed to teach remote workers and those who hire them how to work better together. A community for owners, managers, leaders, freelancers, contractors, and all variety of remote worker, Team Made Apart is also a terrific resource for companies interested in implementing remote work policies in otherwise co-located environments, or for those planning to build fully distributed organizations from the jump. Listeners of this podcast have an exciting opportunity to get involved in the remote work revolution. In light of current events related to the coronavirus pandemic and a sudden worldwide shift to remote work, we're offering a free remote work best practices guide for leaders who find themselves struggling to create a remote work policy in a pinch. Now, and for the duration of the crisis, visit teammadeapart.com/crisis to not only download your free Team Made Apart Remote Policy Primer, how to write remote work policies that don't suck, but to find other tools and resources to help you weather the storm. Great working relationships make for great remote work experiences, and with this free guide, you'll be better equipped to do your part in creating and maintaining a happy and sustainable remote life. Once again, to take advantage of this collection of useful resources, please visit teammadeapart.com/crisis, that is teammadeapart.com/crisis, to download your free best practices guide. One more thing before we kick off the show. Now, and for the foreseeable future, teammadeapart.com is offering free support and advice to remote workers and remote leaders alike through Team Made Apart Open Office. From noon to 2 p.m. Mountain Time, Monday through Friday, you can visit teammadeapart.com and navigate to the bottom left-hand corner of the page where you'll find a chat icon. Simply click it and you'll be connected to a real, remote work expert who is happy to help you solve problems in real time at no charge to you. Of course, you can use the same tool 24/7, 365 to ask questions or request services, but during open office hours, you've got a direct line of communication to people who care and people who can help. Once again, from noon to 2 p.m. Mountain Time, Monday through Friday, simply navigate to teammadeapart.com, find our chat icon in the bottom left-hand corner of the page, then click for instant support when you need it at no cost to you. Take advantage of this special program while it lasts, and now, back to the show. This week, we have special guest Rowena Hennigan. Rowena is a remote skills educator, keynote speaker, and project consultant currently based in Zaragoza, Spain. She began working remotely in 2007, but in the last 3 years specifically, she has fine-tuned her focus on remote skills education and best practices. Since that time, Rowena has co-founded and authored the Remote Skills Undergrad L8 module for TU Dublin, and most recently co-created remoteworktree.com with fellow remote work advocate Robert Kropp. She is a regular guest on webinars and podcasts worldwide, and we are thrilled to have her with us today. Please join me in welcoming our guest, Rowena Hennigan. Hey, Rowena, welcome to the show. So glad to have you.
Hi, Ryan. Lovely to chat with you today.
Yeah, I can't wait. I've really been looking forward to this conversation. So, maybe before we get real deep into this thing, let's talk a little bit about who you are, where you come from, and why we're talking.
So my name is Rowena Hennigan, and I'm actually sitting near my home office in Zaragoza in the north of Spain. And so I decided to move on to the sofa for doing this podcast interview. And I've been living in Spain for about 3 years, coming up on 3 years in April, actually. But I'm originally from the west coast of Ireland, Galway, on the west coast of Ireland.
Well, that makes sense. It didn't sound like much of a Spanish accent. So that sounds, or makes a complete sense.
Exactly. I've got a bit of a twang in there. The Irish accent never quite leaves you.
So tell me about your background. How did you get started in the remote workspace?
Well, I've actually been working remote on and off since about 2007, but in my early career working in telecommunications back in the sort of 90s, early 2000s, I was working for companies like Vodafone over a quite a long period of time, 8-9 years. And at that stage, we would all occasionally work flexibly or work from home, working on different projects. and we would go to an office space, but it was back in the early days of remote, and it wasn't really called remote work as such. But then fast forward a few more years, and when I had a family and when I had moved back to Ireland, I happened to get a couple of jobs that were more flexible, and it was a part of the company policy where they would say, oh, we work from home different days a week, and yeah, it was encouraged. So I sort of transitioned back into it around 2007, and it became more of a way of life for me. It suited me really well, Ryan, because my daughter has quite severe asthma. She's growing out of it slowly now, but back then, when she was young, we were surviving. Myself, and my husband were surviving on very little sleep, so it was quite important. The various naps we could grab during the middle of the day. So a couple of those jobs, including one of them with a university in Dublin, doing some lecturing, freelance. They said, "Oh, it's fine if you want to do that off different work from home, different days." And I slowly transitioned to working quite a lot from home. I enjoyed it more and more, and I would go into the office occasionally in Dublin. But it just became more of a way of life. And combined with that, 3 years ago, one of the main reasons we came to Spain was our daughter's health, because the climate is much better here. My husband is a remote worker as well. He manages a virtual team of tech developers with a company that are 80% remote, a tech company. So we got the opportunity to come to Zaragoza, and we grabbed it because of the fact we knew that the weather would be better for our daughter. There's a really good health system here. And so I found myself 3 years ago fully remote. I don't have a physical office that I go to. I'm a freelancer here in Spain, but I have still maintained my various contracts with some clients in Ireland, including that university that I mentioned, and some other ones. So for me, especially the last 3 years, it's been a fantastic opportunity to live a really good work-life balance in terms of achieving a lot of my career goals, but also being able to be present at home and have the flexibility I need for my family.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. And honestly, that's why so many people turn to remote, is to look for some of that, work-life balance. I mean, there are plenty of positives, plenty of negatives, I guess, also, but it's definitely one of those things I think people start looking forward to. And it is interesting that you bring up the idea of doing it in part for your daughter, because that flexibility built into remote work sure makes childcare easier. So that's great.
Exactly. So, I mean, when you've got a sick child, or you're in any situation as a carer with someone in your family, whatever it may be, any personal situation where work and life are so intertwined, and sleep is so important. Sleep is very important as well. You don't necessarily conscientiously, it's something that allows you the flexibility, and it enables you. And actually, over the 3 years, it's only been the sort of maybe the second half of that where, and my daughter's a bit older now, and there's more sleep happening, but I've really moved into being fully remote and really enjoying it, and being a freelancer, and really having the opportunity to look back and reflect and appreciate the benefits, and really take in all the benefits, because to be honest, every day there's more that I notice.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. Well, and I can relate, as a freelancer, work from home guy myself. I mean, it's the little things. Like last week, I was able to attend. My youngest son had a little program at school where I could go and watch him sing and hang out with his friends and stuff. And so, but if I was working a traditional job, or if I was, in the factory or someplace downtown, like I wouldn't be able to just cut out, go to the program, and come back. And I'm also responsible for taking kids to school in the morning, picking them up after school a lot of times, things like that. And the flexibility built into my work life makes that possible.
Exactly. So, and I think particularly with the awareness about the environment and carbon emissions, all of us being conscious, there's also been that whole area of the benefits of remote work. There's lots of research around socioeconomic productivity from the employer's perspective, and certainly some employees choosing it because they prefer to work that way. But also more and more, the community of remote workers that I move in, they're noticing how much more environmentally friendly it is, and that's something. Like the other day, I managed to pop out, like you said, the flexibility of a day, being able to go to your son's event or whatever. I popped out early in the day to go to a farmer's market here in Zaragoza, and I bought lots of fresh fruit and vegetables and other products, and that ability to shop locally, buy fresh fruit and veg, simple things like that. But there, some of these small things, they seem like little benefits or insignificant, but add it all up together, the cumulative effect is really interesting. And if we think of lots and lots of people doing that, more and more people doing it, I certainly think that the true benefit of remote work is still emerging.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Like you mentioned the sort of carbon footprint piece of remote work. And, for a lot of people, like, I mean, even myself included, like that was a benefit that I didn't even pick up on for the first little while. I mean, I actually had to start digging into the space a little bit to discover that. And it's so obvious now when I think about it. But I mean, if you think of like cities like Los Angeles or even there near Zaragoza and Barcelona, I mean, traffic is gridlock like all day. Like,
exactly.
I mean, if you could take 20% of the workers off the road, or 10% even off the road, like what would that do for traffic? I mean, Los Angeles is in a persistent state of traffic jam. Like if you could get, that many cars off the road because people were working from home or from co-working facilities or whatever, I mean, it'd be incredible. It'd be wildly impactful just to everybody's time, and not to mention the environmental impact.
Exactly, and I've seen. I think where it is really resonating is even in the something like this, where you and I can record this podcast long distance using video conferencing tools, and every business travel meeting that avoids a plane trip as well. And there's more and more of it happening with the coronavirus. In the last few weeks, we've seen Mobile World Conference cancelled in Barcelona, and I saw lots of activity in my network where people were just organizing virtual conferences and virtual networks and events to fill that gap. So I mean, that's a really terrible, sad situation globally. But again, this remote work angle, this video conference, it's a solution. And if we can stand back and look, we can say, actually, there's more and more benefits.
Well, and that's sort of my thought on that subject also is, as a result of this coronavirus outbreak, there are a lot of people in China who've been forced to work from home. And obviously that doesn't really apply to the people who are working in labor forces or things like that, where they're going into the factories. But for all these white collar jobs and anybody, in a technical or marketing field or anything like that, where they're able to work from home, they've been encouraged to do so, which is, I guess, from what I understand, a little outside of the cultural norm for that part of the world. And so I think it's really, I mean, I guess if you have to call it something, it's sort of the silver lining to this coronavirus thing, is that it forced them into a situation that now actually might help encourage this type of work relationship in the future, not because of reasons of epidemic, but for reasons of practicality or keep people off the roads or carbon footprint, like you mentioned.
Exactly. Well, you can imagine maybe some of the conversations where over mobile phone or whatever, if a team of workers are stranded or they can't come in to an office job in China, and I mean, it's happening now in other countries in Asia as well with some of the lockdown that's happening in the epidemic. But you can imagine where a boss might say, or a team leader, well, I trust you'll do the work. You have to be at home, but I trust you do and there's the gold nugget, because why wouldn't you trust me anyways with me going through my head or be my response? And it is an extreme situation, but exactly as you say, the silver lining possibly could be a shift. And even if the shift is only for so many, only a percentage, or it proves that it can be done, and even if it ends up that, for example, a company might say, well, 1 day a week, I guess the thing is with it's not all or nothing with remote work as well, as we know, and whatever model works for both the company and the individual is what works. And for some people and for some company examples, that 1 or 2 days a week is what works for them with flexibility. And I'm pro all of it, because I think it's all part of a potential continuum of progress. So if someone wants to put the toe in the water and just enable 1 day or a couple of days a month or whatever, it's all moving in the right direction.
I think it's incredible. And in places that are so densely populated, like that part of the world, I mean, what a boon that could be to the,
quality of life, or I mean, just, air quality and traffic and everything else, and not to mention the cultural shift, like you mentioned, this nugget of trust, right? I mean, because really that's one of the biggest pieces in sort of a remote work life or remote work policy is your employer needs to trust you. And, and it's funny to think about it, but they often sort of act as if it's, it's under the guise of control. And so they're pretending to be in control, but the reality is they just don't trust you yet. And so in a situation like what's going on in China, they've been forced to have to trust their people because we have to keep the economy moving. And as a result, I think they're, going to see a lot of positives from it, despite the negative outcomes of the outbreak itself. So let's go ahead and transition a little bit. So in your background, you spend a lot of time educating remote workers on how to do a better job of getting remote work, also advocating on behalf of people to become remote workers. Let's talk a little bit about that. Like how, what sorts of skills and things should people start looking at if they are interested in pursuing a career in remote work?
Well, I'm going to jump back to when I did my dissertation in 1999 to set the scene for that, because actually when I was studying my master's in Strathclyde, the University of Strathclyde at the time, I wrote my dissertation. It was very early days, pre-Alta Vista, Yahoo, or they were just starting. So anyone listening who's got their stripes in terms of being an internet veteran will know what I'm talking about with those terms. But I wrote it on creating virtual communities to assistance in exporting in Scotland. So it was looking at how the internet, and this was really early days of email and websites, and basic forums, nothing like we have now, nothing like the instant messaging we have now, could perhaps connect a potential exporter with a customer or client in other countries and link them all up together. So roll on all these years, as I've been working in education for about 8 years at third level, and it's mostly postgrad. I started off working in digital communications and marketing, but over the last few years, that's changed more to being how can you communicate online? And within that, a few years ago, I started looking at not just, for example, designing blogs and how the web is different in terms of communication, but also how you do things like this, how a student might host a video conference or run a webinar, and that began to look at these virtual communication skills, all the things that you might need to do what I do day to day, to do what many companies like Automatic and Buffer, the type of people they're looking for in terms of remote workers. But interestingly, the majority of that work that I do is in person. So I would do it in person in classes in Ireland. I'd go into the university. Some of it is virtual as well, or I work with a team to do that. So the most recent module or course that we've developed at TU Dublin, which is Technological University Dublin, is really interesting because 60% of it is delivered physically. So there's 2 lecturers that go in and deliver the classes in person, and I deliver the 40% online from Zaragoza back to Dublin, practicing what I preach. and what we do is we look at what those future of work skills are, those remote work skills. But within that, Ryan, we also, and I'm doing it virtually, but the other lecturers, we get students to stand up and present. We get them to work in groups. There's a workshop angle, there's a breakout angle, and we do this online as well. So the sort of skills that you need, and the World Economic Forum recently spoke about this as well. Yes, we're going to need coding skills for the 4th Industrial Revolution. Yes, we're going to need analytical and programmers, all these, the tech skills. But we also need the people skills, and we need them more and more in relation to the fact that when we think of AI and computers and everything. And we are, it's future graduate students that are coming through. They're very digitally literate, so they can use computers. They're the mobile phone generation, but they maybe don't necessarily have some of those other soft skills, right? And I don't really like the word soft because for me, it's like it gives the impression of fluffy. I call them power skills. Okay, I like to call them power skills, and I don't know where I got them from. It's not mine. I'm not going to claim it, but it's the sort of things like the ability to communicate effectively, the ability to actively listen, like the way that I can hopefully answer your questions. We can have a good interactive exchange, negotiation, conflict, creativity, all those other skills that you don't just get from being able to use Microsoft Excel or a certain particular coding program. So with a lot of the work that I do, I emphasize that. I emphasize that the soft skills as well, no matter what way I'm delivering, okay, whether it's webinar or in person. And it's really interesting to me to see that these skills are being called out more and more in terms of what's needed in the future.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's actually something I call the new old way. And it's this idea that, despite our technological advancements and how good things have gotten, I mean, especially here in the sphere of remote work, I mean, communication across long distances is better now than it's ever been. I mean, you mentioned earlier, I mean, look at us. We're talking, although I would much rather be in Zaragoza right now. I mean, we're, thousands of miles apart, and it's as if we're in the same room, more or less, But I will always say that, if we were having this conversation in Zaragoza over a cup of coffee, it would be maybe a little better. Maybe it's 10% better, probably matters to some people more than others. But the idea is basically that, technology is great and it's empowered us to do a lot of things, but you'll never be able to, or at least I shouldn't say never, because God knows I'll come up with something. But it's going to be mighty difficult to replace real life human interaction. And part of it is this, and it's just what you said, that this idea that just because we're remote doesn't mean we shouldn't still have all the traits or the characteristics or the skills of somebody who has, is good at developing relationships. You've got to be able to talk. You've got to be able to communicate back and forth. You've got to be able to listen. All these skills that you're talking about. And I love framing them as power skills, because to call them soft skills does diminish them a little bit. And I think that they're every bit as important, maybe more so even than the technology.
Yeah, and I got asked, like I did I've done some keynotes and in-person presentations and gotten good feedback, but as a lecturer, that's what I've been doing for so long, so I should be quite good at presenting. But someone asked me, they said, where did you learn to be so confident and present on a stage? And I said, actually, it was when I was at school as a teenager. I was on the debating team. And I learned from being in live competitions. We got to the All Ireland finals, which we were, really happy with. It was a good level within Ireland. But I learned to construct arguments on the fly. I learned to think of the others, creativity, response, presentation, the list of things. You get them from Toastmasters, from debating, from drama, from lots of, but these are not academic things where you're sitting studying. They're things that can be enjoyable. And people in a choir would also have an ability to present themselves, project their voice, etc., etc. So what I do with students is, because obviously in the finite amount of time, I talk about how they're important as well. Those skills are important. But what's really interesting, what's come out, which I wanted to touch on today from the World Economic Forum, in the list of different things that will be needed in the future. I mean, problem solving. So the list you would expect to see things are on there, but one of them is emotional intelligence. And self-awareness within that, Ryan, it keeps coming back again and again, right? And as a key trait for leadership, and also for this type of virtual collaboration and effective collaboration. And emotional intelligence is also really linked to mental health. And one of the negatives that, and one of the risks for remote work is possibly isolation, as you probably may know, or a slight disconnection from colleagues. And interestingly for me, I think that I talk about emotional intelligence, that self-awareness, being really important to students as well, about what they want from their role, from their job, what they want from day to day, and how they're experiencing it. And the important point of that is something called self-reflection, which can be just simple journaling, having a mentor, having a friend you regularly talk to, maybe having a colleague in work. It doesn't matter what way you do it, but some way of self-reflecting and having that self-awareness. And then that often helps you to deal with whatever it is in terms of challenges at work, or even reflecting as a student. And in most management theory and most postgrad courses around the world, you will find, particularly on MBAs, they talk about self-reflection, and that self-awareness is a key part of emotional intelligence. And I see that coming across as well, actually linking it to industry in a lot of the remote role specs that I would see and details. So that would be the other talking point that I would say to them. How do you self-reflect? What do you do? Are you self-aware? And even if they don't answer me straight away as part of, and also my colleagues physically in Dublin, we covered a lot to sort of get them to try and adopt that practice of stopping and thinking.
Yeah, no, I think that's huge. And, I live with a 13-year-old, so I can relate to a lot of this stuff because, he's going through this, and I see this with his friends all the time, this idea of sort of just being self-aware and understanding the impact that whatever you're doing has on other people. And I think, I turned 40 in just a few days. And so,
well, happy birthday.
Thank you. And so, but I only say that to say that there's, I think, kind of a sweet spot for people about my age or in and around my age, where we had the opportunity to spend part of our life pre-internet and part of our life post-internet. Because like for people like me, we grew up with, as the internet developed, and we had to learn some of those core competencies early on, but we had already sort of figured out how to work with people, like that was part of some, just being alive back then. And I think now, not to say that it doesn't still exist, but it's sure a lot easier for a young person to come up through the ranks and spend a heck of a lot more time in technology. So they may be better at sort of navigating tech and living in those spaces, but I do think that maybe they are underdeveloped in terms of how much time they spend, really developing interpersonal relationships. It doesn't get done by text; it gets done by, going out and doing stuff with each other. And I see that even with my kids, we'll have the whole football team over to the house, and everybody will be on their phones. I mean, there's 12 guys sitting in the room, and they're all on the phone. It's like nobody's spending this time together, and these are that prime time that they should be developing the interpersonal skills that'll help them later in life as they start looking for work, remote or otherwise. And so I think that's one key difference between sort of the generation that's coming up now versus those of us that are just a tad older. And not to make it a battle of the generations or anything, but I think that there's some disadvantage that they've been given, to the extent that technology has just been such a key part of their lives.
Exactly, but it's interesting, isn't it, that a lot of, never mind just even remote jobs, where if you're applying for some of the ones within our community and the remote community, they will look for video interviews. They will look for examples of you doing keynote presentations, but also increasingly for other mainstream jobs, it's the same. They will get you in, you will present, right? Even for graduate roles. So it's really interesting that exactly, and I've actually come across some fantastic students in my days who are so nervous about presenting and whose interpersonal skills in terms of confidence, and then they don't even know how to go about dealing with it. But I also think that that's also because they haven't had that chance to sit down and say, well, this is what I need to work on. And try and put in the thing about journaling or even discussing it with a friend and then taking action, whatever way you get it out into the world and out of your head, is that you notice those areas for improvement. And I'm quite a positive person, a glass half full person, and I believe even noticing them is half the battle sometimes. Even if it's noticing that I need to be a little bit more careful of how I write my emails, or whatever that little thing is. I need to stop using technical language. We all have our little things that we know we need to improve, but even once you've noticed it, I believe that it's a real step in the right direction to then beginning to improve it, noticing what you need to improve and filling those gaps. But yeah, so it's fantastic to be able to work with TU Dublin and to develop. I mean, it's a level 8 module. It's the first of its type in Ireland. I'm also doing some other consultancy work with some other organizations to build these remote skills training, right? And it's fantastic to have the opportunity. But I'm also fascinated in noticing myself and what I need to learn, because the advantage I feel I have is day to day, I am the remote worker. I am practicing what I preach. What can I do day to day that just also builds and supports development for the rest of my peers, for the rest of the community? So being involved in the module in Dublin where I had to deliver the 40% virtually, it was fantastic. And there's one little anecdote that I think you'll find interesting from that, Ryan, is that I asked at the end, and it was towards the end of the module, about 10 weeks out of 12, I asked my students that were online on the virtual webinar, I asked them if they would want to work remotely. Did they fancy a remote job? And they were all 2021 studying a undergrad master's in HR management, and about a quarter of them said no. And I asked one of them directly, I said, so you said no on the group chat. I went to her and I said, why did you say no? And she said, I can see the value of it. I see why it's really important for us to understand it, and it's really important for a company to potentially offer it and have policies and all that. She said, but for my first graduate role, I want to be in an office. I want social interaction. I picture myself for the first few years mingling in the office, going to work. And I went, fantastic. I love it. It's a conscientious choice. You understand what you want. You're that self-aware at 21. Hooray. I'm delighted for you. And that is the type, so the point I'm trying to make is it's not for everyone. She could still see the benefits, but also that's what I want for the future. I'm not a remote fits all person. I'm very much a realist about it's about personal choice. And for that particular person, maybe in 10 years time, it'll suit their career stage, their lifestyle, whatever their personal situation. But yeah, it was really good to have that checkpoint in terms of working with the students and have someone say no and the reasons for no, to really have a balanced view, if that makes sense, on the whole.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good. And actually, I mean, it made me think of a couple of things. I think for a lot of folks, especially in sort of this remote work advocacy, as you become really close, it starts to sound like or feel like we're just saying, no, it should all be remote. Everything must be remote. When in reality, I think it is this balancing act, right? I mean, I think remote is, or the idea of working remote is supposed to be in addition to, it's not instead of. And so, it's to allow more flexibility and, like you mentioned, personal choice, or to adapt to a lifestyle or whatever. It's about, part of it is employee happiness, making sure that you're getting what you would like out of your career. And then part of it too is, how does it affect the business positively? Are there things that, how it helps them? And so I think that, this student of yours, is really, I guess, astute. She's not caught up in the picture of the digital nomad sitting on the beach and saying, I must go work this way. That I really think for a lot of remote workers, having the opportunity to work in-house and actually be surrounded by people and understand the inner workings of an office environment is really a critical thing to know if you are going to go remote eventually. Like, you have to have some empathy for what's happening in the office. And so, and I mean, I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that you must work in an office in order to work remotely. But I think that will give you one extra layer of experience that will help you become a better remote worker.
Definitely. And I think we're going to see a big shift in the next few years in graduate recruitment programs, graduate international programs that already exist, because I work on one with the university where students spend part of their time with a company as a sort of intern or on placement. But I see there'll be more of those with a remote mix, Ryan. We're going to see there is new internships coming out with remote companies. I think it's going to become much more mixed up and fluid, whatever suits a particular company and how they're going to work it. And there's going to be lots of different models. I just hope that there's more case studies and more research and more so that we can bring those examples back to both the students and the potential employers. There's a lot of focus on the 100% remote companies as best case because they're so transparent. They are these bastions of trust and transparency, and they publish everything on the web. And that's where, for example, for a lot of the content I prepare, I can really get easy access to go, here's the GitLab handbook for policy for employment, or here's the diversity and inclusion. And then there's lots of brilliant examples, and to name but a few. But hopefully there'll be more. There's a couple of companies like HubSpot, for example, which have got a remote division now, and there's some others coming forward, like some of the bigger names that you would know, particularly in finance and consulting, that actually have a remote policy or are moving that way, but they're starting to talk about it more, and they may be publishing some information on it. So it's great to see a bit more of that hybrid mix coming through, and a sharing of best practice. And at the end of the day, it's about not just the personal choice, it's about the work getting done. And I just would love to see whatever about all the benefits, that we're more talking about people's performance. For me, certainly, given my situation over the last 4 years, I can talk from, I was getting the work done at the times where I could perform, where I had sleep later in the day after a nap or whatever. And it's beginning to change that way, I think, more as well, where if the work is done, that's what matters in the main.
Yeah, and there's so much perception to be overcome, right? I mean, there's a lot of these companies that, again, it goes back to trust, like we were talking about earlier, that you will actually be able to perform when you're not there. But it is sort of a two-way street, right? I mean, you also have to live up to the expectation you're setting. So, but I think that so much is in the intention, right? You've got a lot of people who, just as I've started working or started my work in this remote, advocacy space or whatever we call it. I've started to get a lot of people asking me, hey, I work for so-and-so company. I would like to go remote, but I don't know how to approach my boss, that kind of thing. And what I found in most of them are coming with a story that is very them-centric. It's, I want to work from home. I want to sleep in a little bit in the morning, so I want to be back. I want to come in a little later, or I want to do whatever. It's really more about them than it is about the company. And I think it's really important to sort of look at both sides of that coin.
Yeah, and actually that's really interesting, because that brings us back to the power skills. Okay, and negotiation, all those things we were talking about a few minutes ago, because and don't get me wrong, it's just a mindset shift. But again, people approaching, I mean, there's templates on the internet, Ryan. There's lots of advice on the internet. This is how you approach your boss to, approach your company to bring in a remote policy or ask for flexible working. But at the end of the day, and don't get me wrong, there's some companies you would never shift them. Maybe it's never going to happen. But I always find it interesting. It's about the way you approach it in terms of exactly that. What would their side be? What are their barriers? How can I answer and come with solutions to them? How can I broach it that it's a trial? So really negotiation, power, being really creative about how you think about it and approach it. But also I'm going to add something else to that, because in terms of the high performance, or the key traits of remote workers, Roberta Sawatsky out of Canada, who is a professor who's done some work on this, she published an article a few weeks ago, and three of the key traits, I mean, it's interesting when you look at them, is conscientiousness, the key traits for potential remote workers, adjustment and curiosity, right? And that adjustment and flexibility also works in with having a little bit of a risk taker in there. And you won't be surprised by me saying that. So what I'm trying to say to you is, there are people that are coming looking to go remote, and it's like anything where there's a hype, or I want to do it because everyone, it'll be better for me. It may not suit them. Let's start there. But also, are they risk averse or not, as well? Because I think if you really want it, and this is why there's a strong link, as you know, between remote and freelancers and gig economy, and we tend to be a little bit more, for whatever reason, personally, say to ourselves, well, okay, I'm going to leave the 9 to 5 or the secure paycheck. Yeah. And I'm going to go and I'm going to find work, freelance or whatever. So, but all of those traits fit in with the freelancer mentality as well, fit in with the gig economy mentality. So I just think there's some interesting things to notice there as well in terms of.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think it does sort of all tie back into this conversation we're having about these soft skills. And I mean, the one that we kind of beat the drum on was this idea of self-awareness. And I mean, what better application for being self-aware than approaching a employer and saying, hey, I'd like to now work remotely. I mean, you've got to have a full understanding of how they're going to feel about the situation, and employ some empathy, and, be thoughtful about your request, and how does it benefit the company? I mean, ultimately you're working for an employer. You've got to make the situation better for them, or at least equitable for them. And so I think it's really important to do that. And so focusing in on some of these interpersonal skills and being able to develop the, empathy and the curiosity and all these other things that you've mentioned, I think is really key. Do you have any thoughts or any pointers on that? So, I mean, how do people go and get these skills? Like you mentioned for freelancers and people who, may have sort of I don't know if it's genetic, but there's some proclivity for wanting to do this kind of work. I mean, I've been doing this most of my life, and I know other people who are like me that have been doing it that way. And, and then I know other people who they want the security of sitting in an office and they're good with punching the clock, it's all good. So if you are just, you don't have these skills, but you want to start getting into this world, how do you, outside of the genetic component, how do you starting to learn the skills, or how do you practice them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think you need to have a little bit more direction first of exactly where you're going within a remote role. So I would first advise that if you came to me with that question, I'd say, well, what type of remote role are you after? Just give me, a general idea. Is it entry level? Is it tech based? Is it customer support? Whatever it may be. And then you need to go and look at a good place to start is to look at the job listings. And because again, in a lot of those companies like that I've mentioned, the leading ones, and on various websites, you can see some of those key traits, right? But what I always advise anyone who asks me is, what do you already have? Because we're not very good judges, Ryan, often of the skills we already have. And in my experience anyways with students, I've observed, and even with peers, that they sometimes have the skills, but they don't realize. And also, they don't have the right terminology for the skills, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So, for example, someone who might be working in finance, but who might be a scout leader or work voluntary in the community and has organized loads of events and has lots of really good, and worked with, say, in the States with other scout leaders, whatever, has got collaboration and organization skills that they don't count particularly. I come across it a lot with students doing their LinkedIn profile. They're not able to stand back and go, oh, but I did that and I did that and that meets that skill. So I use something like a power skills checklist, or I start them talking in groups about different skills, like we've spoken about earlier in this discussion. And actually, by sharing little stories of different experiences, they come up with those skills. And they write them down and they come up with examples of them. So I think knowing the direction you want to go, to summarize, in terms of a remote role and looking what the skills they look for, but then starting to journal or working with a mentor or working with someone, even a buddy, to start to say, okay, actually I have these skills. Some of them I just need to either use the right terminology, I need to document them a bit better, and then of course move on to the gaps. Yeah,
I think that mentorship and having someone to talk to about all this stuff is so critical, because it really is about framing the conversation, right? You never see yourself in the way others see you. So it's really valuable to have somebody else, a peer or another student or anybody, that can just sort of talk to you about that, even talk to your parents or something and say, hey, look, I'm interested in pursuing this role, but I don't know if I check all these boxes. And they'll be the ones that point out, oh yeah, well, you've been doing, so-and-so for a year, you can easily do that. That kind of thing. And so I think it is important to do that. And, as important as self-reflection is, it is tough to overcome some of those hurdles. And I don't know if it's a confidence thing or an ego getting in the way kind of thing, or I'm not sure what it is that, is keeping us from being able to do that. But I mean, as you were saying it, I'm going, yes, I do that all the time. I never think I can do X, Y, and Z. And then it's my wife who goes, what are you talking about? You do that all the time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but I mean, but even the fact that that you're not, or a bit like me saying I need to speak slower because us Irish speak quite fast, or I have a tendency to use jargon. We all have our little gotchas. It's not knowing those gotchas and not even being open to taking feedback from someone. But yeah, the mentor, the buddy, which you see happening quite a lot. I mean, obviously, if you're younger, there's career guidance, potentially support available, but I also sprinkle a sort of real measure of reality as well. I wrote a blog post on this the other day as well about, do you really know what, particularly entry-level remote, So coming back to that idea that you've maybe not been in the office at all, Ryan, as a younger person, or you're coming back to work after years out of the office and maybe craving that social interaction, that going fully remote might not be good for you in terms of it is sitting at a computer, potentially not having lots of interaction depending on the role, potentially dealing with different time zones, etc., etc. So I also think that there's a Remote Habits, which is a remotehabits.com, has interviews with lots of different types of remote workers. And it's sort of asks them about their day and what their day looks like and how they work, all different types of roles. And that's a really good place to start as well, to actually understand what remote is like, really, before saying, totally committing to it or totally going in the direction. I recommend that to people as well, and I mentioned that in the blog post, because you can never do enough research. Like any kind of career shift, it'll all stand to you in the long term.
Yeah, well, and I think it's a lot like anything in life, right? I mean, whether it's having kids or moving or starting a new career, like, there's no time like the present. Like, it just has to happen. If you spend too much time worrying about it or trying to figure it out, you'll just put yourself in a position where don't move forward at all. So I think it's really important to just sort of take those steps, and be intentional about what it is you're trying to do, because I think that intention is what will give you the fuel to overcome some of the hurdles or the problems that you'll encounter along the way. So let's talk a little bit, just as we're starting to wind down here. A lot of your background is in education and working for institutions of higher education, that kind of thing. We've alluded to it a little bit in this conversation, but this idea of sort of lifelong learning, I think it's really critical, especially, in remote work, as, the whole landscape is changing week to week to week with technology, technological advances, and as more and more companies are beginning to come online with remote work policies and the like, how do you, as an educator, how would you encourage people to get into the habit of lifelong learning? Like, I think there are some people who are naturally curious, like we've talked about the sort of genetic implications of this stuff. But, if somebody needs to develop the skill, maybe they don't have a natural curiosity, but they're willing to come by it through hard work. How would you sort of encourage someone to get started in a path of lifelong learning, and making sure that the learning they're doing is relevant or is what they should be learning?
Well, that's a really good question. Actually, when I was thinking about preparing for the podcast, I knew that one of the key remote companies, and it's Automatic, their first point in their creed of operations, or the company mission and policies, is I will never stop learning. Okay, so they're fully remote, one of the biggest known ones. And I even think that I will never stop learning is beautiful. I love it, because I mean, even this hour with you, or whatever time I spend with you, I'm learning from the experience. And the thing about saying that to yourself, for me, is that it's okay to always be learning, and not always by default know the answer to the question, and not be an expert at everything. And I think that lifelong learning is an attitude. Okay, and we talk about certainly in executive education and the level I lecture and teach at, we talk about growth and fixed mindset, and we talk about having this growth mindset, that I'm always open to learning, I'm open to making mistakes. And what happens, especially in some senior levels and a postgraduate education, you come across quite senior executives, and it's just that they've been in the same position for a long time. And it's that age-old thing, Ryan, of people not liking change. They have their persona, they have their profile, and they're kind of like, this is me and I'm the boss, or whatever. And what you're trying to do is say, hang on, no, you're always learning. And fair enough, they're probably very successful entrepreneurs or whatever. So they need to make that shift when they come along to do postgraduate education. And they need to acknowledge that I have to have an open mind at every step. I need to be looking for my mindset to grow. I will never stop learning. And that's something that I mean, lifelong learning is kind of a state of mind for me. But what I find is that you have to have, I don't use the word loosely, commitment. And I talk from a very knowledgeable place with that word, because I've learned Spanish in the last 3 years to, kind of an
I can relate.
not easy, an intermediate level. So I believe I've got the war wounds
No
to
doubt.
show. Yeah, and that has been over 2.5 years intensive study, 12 hours a week at a back sitting in the students' place in the room that I'm usually at the top of. So you just need to have that commitment in terms of learning. There is a whole load of discipline and commitment, but I also think it's very much the attitude, if that makes sense. And it really depends on why you're learning something. And that's where that kind of self-reflection, whether it be journaling, which I do, and I do use some buddies as well, but you said about the mentoring and buddy, like, if you have a mentor or a buddy and you dedicate yourself to, for example, learn a language or learn a new coding skill or whatever it may be, you will have them to check in with, and they'll go, oh, how are you going? How is that exam? Or how did you get on in that interview? Whatever it may be. And then that helps you have the milestones and the progression, because they're your little reflection on yourself. So lots of the things we've spoken about over the last few minutes, it's all that combined. It's all that combined together that I think helps you become a lifelong learner. But what's really interesting is that actually in the Sustainable Development Goals from the UN, number 4 calls out lifelong learning, right?
Oh, interesting.
And is for me, because I have the passion of linking it back to the environment and sustainability. I find it really interesting because I love to see that term in there, because I think as you can be the biggest thought leader in the world, you can be the whatever, be right up on this pedestal in terms of your level and everything, but we're all learning. And I think that also, as an extension of that mantra, I will never stop learning, that we're also helping sustainability. Because if we accept that we all have to learn and everyone needs to learn, that we don't know it all, I think it also helps for just global understanding, for want of a better term, and all being on the same page in terms of, there's lots that we can do that are better. There's lots of areas of improvement. Share your knowledge with me, etc., which really is interesting in terms of that link back to sustainability.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great observation, because it's, one of the things that I think of too, when I think of some of this stuff, is how much pressure it takes off you. If you don't come out, and you don't have to be the expert all the time, and you can always be a little bit fluid and willing to hear another person's perspective, and then either adopt what you like or discard what you don't. I think this ability to sort of ebb and flow a little bit is maybe more in tune with what it means to be a human than this idea that you know everything, and by all means, if you don't know the answer, then nobody knows it, and that kind of thing. Like, I think it's a really important characteristic, this idea that you're always learning, and I think curiosity is sort of that key word, right? I mean, that you always have an interest. And, but that is also, related, or kissing cousins to empathy and self-reflection and all these other things we're talking about, so I think an improvement in all that space is really an improvement sort of in the human condition. And I think, being a better person or a better human, getting better at being a human will help us all in life and work and all
exactly.
that.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
And interestingly, if you're always open to learning, I mean, one of the fundamentals when you talk about advanced remote working and facilitation and collaboration, and the way we're moving with technology to be able to do these podcasts, to be able to work on whiteboards in tandem, have massive, and with virtual reality where there'll be architects working on drawings together, etc., all these technological advances are all around collaboration. And at a level where we all need to be open to A, learning the tools, it's all about learning, and B, also that the way someone might virtually show us something or at a distance, and going, okay, being open to that, qualifying it, interacting, learning. So, I mean, it all links back together. So for me, like, I think lifelong learning in terms of, there is another point, of course, in terms of how the the remote industry and the verticals within remote, and I know it's across different industry verticals, but remote as a community is still pretty much in its infancy, and there's been it's been a fast infancy, and there's been fantastic strides with some of the 100% remote companies. But what I also hope to see is then great strides in terms of sharing that learning and knowledge, so that other companies can catch up. A lot of the information is open source as well that's being shared. It's the same within academia and different projects. So I really like that there's that open view that we can share the learning, and then tied in with that as well, just to add, because it's within the SDGs as well for the UN, is that makes it more inclusive, Ryan. I know you know that, but if we can spread that around the world a bit more into every corner, every group, we can have a more inclusive workforce across.
Well, yeah, and it's honestly, it's one of the things that got me into this space in the first place, was this idea of helping freelancers like me overcome problems like isolationism and anxiety and separation disorders, things like that, things that aren't the glamorous side of remote work or being a freelancer and working by yourself all the time, but really important things that almost anybody who's done the work can relate to. And so I think it's really important, this idea of being able to move things around. And the more I've started working, with people sort of in my sphere who are largely creative service providers, web designers, graphic designers, these kinds of people, those guys, come from all over the world, and they work in places where their work is very highly commoditized and it's very difficult to make a living. And so for a lot of these people, the ability to leverage something like remote work to find work in the States or in Europe or somewhere else where they, can apply their trade and be paid fairly for it, I think offers tremendous opportunities. And the things that, the very things that we're talking about in this conversation, these different soft skills or power skills, and how to apply them to their lives to become a better remote worker, so they can actually, compete in a marketplace full of people trying to get remote work and a limited number of positions. I think, all these skills, whether you're third world, first world, whatever, I think that, that humanness or that need to be a great human, I think is going to transcend barriers and all those things. And I think we'll find that, over time, the sort of world's economy can sort of grow, or be elevated sort of in unison. It's that, when the rising tide raises all ships, that kind of thing. And so I think remote is one aspect that I think will contribute to that greatly. And I think it's through these skills that gets done.
Definitely, and I love to see, I love to see the small examples that are coming through, even just through my network, of the diversity and inclusion of certain veterans that have managed to go back to work using remote, and other people. Like there's a project with refugees that I know you've mentioned. There's lots of good projects happening. There's a couple of projects in Ireland as well, actually, for back to work, for returners to work, which have a strong remote skills angle that I know of as well, which I'm really happy to see. And they can be people who have been carers for a long time or whatever, but all of that, it's all diversity and geographically, because geographically we're proving it on this podcast. It shouldn't matter really, where you're located, you can do the work. I know that there's legislation and there's policies at a country level, etc., but theoretically those barriers are starting to come down, and every few months there seems to be more examples of that. But with that, I'd love to also see that. It's interesting because I'm tying it round to the start of the conversation again, where we were saying about the best case examples and the examples from all coming from like the 100% remote companies. I'd love to see more and more examples, even more specific examples, like around how, based on evidence-based research or good structured case studies, companies that have really extended their diversity and inclusion policies using remote, for example, companies that have reduced their own carbon footprint, where they've measured before and after by adopting certain remote flexibility. Retention of staff, people that maybe have had to go off for whatever reasons that have come back after a period remotely, etc. So love to see more case studies, research coming through, so that we I'm bringing it back to the benefits again, that we've got more because we're noticing them every day, as we said, on a personal level, but I'd love to see more solid stuff, that, solid research about those benefits. And Laurel Farr is doing some great work, and there's brilliant bits and pieces out there, but more and more coming through, especially from the universities, would be fantastic.
And I think as companies continue to grow and adopt more of this, and countries continue to evolve legislation and things like that, I mean, most countries would benefit from more people working, right? I mean, so this is something that will motivate them. I mean, it just, takes time to make stuff happen. And I think you'll see more of that. A good example is Spain, for example. In their entrepreneurial practices have been really slow to catch up to what it takes to start a business. Here in the States, it's just $25 piece of paper and you're good to go. You're in business. But over in Spain, you have to have, capital investment, costs a lot of money. It takes a lot of time. I think it's about 21 days to get through the process of organizing a business. So if you're from out of country and you're trying to do that in Spain, well, you better plan on staying for a while, because you're going to have to wait, and people are going to be gone for holidays, and people are going to be doing whatever. And, it's a slow process. But I mean, now they've spent a lot of time in the last couple of years really evolving that, making it easier for people to go into business for themselves. And I think a lot of it is being motivated by so many people were doing business, under the radar before, because it was difficult or expensive to get into it. But the easier it is for us to get into business and do it the right way, we'll do it that way. And I think that'll be the same in remote work. The more, commonplace it becomes, and the more companies embrace it, nations embrace it, that sort of thing, we'll start to see all this evidence and research and stuff that you're asking.
Definitely. And even the networking at different conferences that's already been happening will probably happen at that extra level as well. So some of the questions we've spoken about even from various remote workers, individual perspective, how do you work on those power skills where people are being more honest about things that they do? That'll start to get shared as well in terms of best practice and just the community networking better. So I think there's lots to be gained from that, and it's all going in the right direction. So I'm really positive about it, but I'm also aware that, and this is why I do my self-reflection, I'm also aware that I have to take stock every so often so that I can almost digest and process it as well, because it's happening at a pace.
That's
Ryan,
awesome.
so
well, cool. Yeah. Rowena, so as we're starting to get to the end of this thing, where can people find out more about the work you're doing, or get involved in things that you're doing, and just learn more about you yourself?
Well, I've got my own website. That's rowenahennigan.com or rowremote.com. That will get you to the same website. You'll find me under Rowena Hennigan on LinkedIn as well. Any Google search. I use DuckDuckGo at the moment. That'll pull it up as well. Any browser search will pull it up. Pull up my site, pull up my LinkedIn profile. And just drop me a line if you're interested in finding out more about my work. The majority of my work is with educational and training providers, but I do some freelance projects as well, Ryan, some comms projects on occasion, and it keeps me tuned. We're called an academic industry academic in academia. So we're the types that both work as well as deliver lecturing and teaching. So it's a nice combination. And it's been a pleasure talking to you. It's been really good. It's been really good to get the chance to talk through some of the things that I think about. I think about in my journaling.
I am so grateful for your time, and with the time change, it's getting to evening over there, so I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day to do this. I was looking forward to this conversation. I'm glad we had it.
Thanks a million, Ryan. Thanks for your time.
Thanks so much. Have a good one.
Cheers.
I don't owe you anything. I don't know you anything. Anything at all. I don't owe you anything. I don't know you.